So first things first, I'm going to talk about the Little Temple, because that often gets overlooked when people visit it or come to Abu Simbel. And it's one that on the History of Egypt podcast, I didn't get a chance to discuss properly. So I'd like to start with the small temple, and then we'll do our tour of the Great Temple. So we call it a small temple, but it's still pretty freaking huge as far as, your average building goes. In the doorway here, you can see the very faint figure of a man sitting on a chair. That gives you a rough sense of the scale of these statues. They are several meters high. This is still a large monument, even though we call it the small temple. From the facade, two things to understand. We have 4 figures of Ramesses II and then 2 of Nefertari, which sounds kind of strange because we often describe this as being Nefertari's temple. Despite the fact that the monument is partially devoted to the queen and to the goddess Hathor, it is still, in the Egyptian way of looking at things, it is still important that the king be physically present, because before anybody else, the king is the primary connector or intermediary between mortals and the gods. So even though this temple is sort of devoted to the queen, it's still important that Ramesses be there. It's not necessarily his ego, it's more about his place within their society and how he connects us to the divine world. But, of course, Nefertari is kind of the star of this little temple, and that is the way she's portrayed has a very clear connection with the great goddess Hathor. First thing to note is that Nefertari wears her classic crown, which is the type we see in her beautiful tomb in the Valley of the Queens. It starts with a little flat cap. Here it's nice and round. In her tomb, it's kind of two-dimensional. Then a solar disk, because naturally she is symbolically a daughter of Ra and connected with him as part of the divine pantheon. She also has 2 palm fronds as adornments. These are often connected with deities like Amun, particularly, so it gives an extra layer of that divinity. But then the key feature on this temple, which she doesn't have in her tomb, is the cow horns, which kind of frame the crown here. And that connects her especially with the great goddess Hathor. Hathor, of course, is the cow goddess. She is one of the early avatars of motherhood. Also, music, pleasure, sexuality, or in her alter ego of Sekhmet, she can be a real dangerous individual. But here, Nefertari appears both as herself, as a queen, but also as an earthly manifestation of Hathor, the great mother goddess. She even clutches, I should have put an arrow here, she actually clutches a small sistrum rattle, which is decorated with a little Hathor head and a shrine on top. This is one of the classic instruments belonging to Hathor. She is often associated with the sistrum as a goddess of music and also an intermediary between humanity and other deities. So yeah, the temple has figures of Nefertari and Ramesses. Ramesses is there in his role as the divine king. Nefertari is there both as divine queen and also as Hathor. And here's the inside. Now, yes, it is much smaller in terms of scale than the Great Temple, but it's still a most impressive monument. And I think it's a shame that it gets overlooked so much in terms of discussions, because the little temple really is quite cool. And a lot of people, tour groups, will kind of skip it when they go to Abu Simbel. So if you're making a trip there anytime soon, do go spend some time here. It's worth it. On the front of these pillars, on the facades kind of facing inwards, we have the same design of those sistrum rattles that I told you about just before. We have a face of Hathor on the top, and then the long handle. And then on the top, these little rectangular designs are kind of shrines, miniature shrines. But that design actually does show up physically in artifacts for sistrum rattles. They look like this, and you can shake them aloud to awaken the gods and to draw their attention. So this temple is first and foremost a house of Nefertari, but also of Hathor, specifically a local version of Hathor, who is special to this region. But that's what you see when you go in. Hathor is the primary figure. And of course, to reflect that, we have this really significant scene, which, artistically, it doesn't look like much because the color hasn't survived, but it is quite important. To the left of the queen, we have the great goddess Hathor herself, and then to the right, we have Ise, or Isis. And they reach up to physically place or secure the crowns upon the queen's head. Now, this is quite a distinctive motif. It doesn't show up that often, but Ramesses II uses it quite a few times early in his reign, both for himself and for Nefretari. If you wanted to interpret that historically, you could look at it as, Ramesses and his family were not originally royal. They just a few generations earlier, they had been high-ranking military officials, and it was only due to another king that they became royal, that they were appointed to the kingship. So some historians, for example, Kathleen or Karakuni, do kind of see in the early iconography of Ramesses a degree of political and religious insecurity, a sense that perhaps they are not quite as legitimate as they would like to be. And they will often use this motif of the god or goddess, in this particular instance, placing or securing crowns upon the ruler's head in order to emphasize that their power might not come from any blood claim to the throne, but it comes from the gods. The gods have chosen this family. That could be part of the significance here. Now, we get one of the interesting things artistically that goes on in this period is that the goddess Ise, or Isis, starts to take on the visual elements of Hathor. It really starts here in the New Kingdom, especially in the Ramesside era, and over the following 1,000 years, up into the Roman period, Ise, or Isis, kind of takes what Hathor was known for. It gets melded into her personality and her role, and then she becomes the dominant goddess, fulfilling all of those roles moving forward. But at the time of Nefretari, that process is still underway. But you will find that Ise and Hathor, in this left-hand image, they look basically identical. You can't easily tell them apart. The only way you can do it in many of these situations is the hieroglyphs. If you have for Hathor up here on the left, if you have a box with a falcon or bird inside, that is Hathor. That's the literal hieroglyphs, Hut Cher, meaning the enclosure of Horus. For Ise or Isis, you have a throne, which in transliteration is Set, and then a T, which is just the end consonant, and then a little egg, because Ise or Isis is the goddess of motherhood, so she is the one who holds the egg. But that's how you can identify them in many of these cases. It basically comes down to the hieroglyphs. So if you're ever confused, just look for these particular symbols and you'll be able to figure out which goddess it is. Going back to the coronation motif that I mentioned, this is also in the... We find the unusual scene of Sutech, or Seth, and Heru, or Horus, crowning or securing the crown upon Ramesses' head. It shows up in this temple, despite the monument being dedicated to Nefertari and Hathor. But Ramesses still takes the opportunity to emphasize the divine legitimacy of this royal couple over and above what his family might traditionally expect. But it's a damn shame that this temple hasn't survived so well in terms of the paint, because you could imagine that even the little traces here, like of the black on Horus's wig, this was probably intended to pop quite nicely with a white background, white plaster, and really vivid colors. Unfortunately, it's all faded away. Within the temple itself, we get lovely images like Nefertari herself on the left, making offerings to the cow goddess Hathor, who basically wears the same type of crown, even though she appears as a cow, has the plumes, ostrich feathers in this case, with a solar disc. One of the unfortunate things about Abu Simbel and the Nubian temples generally is that they're all constructed out of sandstone, which is what is the dominant stone in this particular region of the Nile. And sandstone just doesn't hold the fine details in terms of carving in the same way that, say, limestone or granite does. which is a damn shame with these temples, because once that plaster has gone, once that paint has gone, then it can look quite rough. But images like these were supposed to be fully colored, very vibrant, beautiful expressions of the artist's craft. But unfortunately today, we really just don't see them in their best. But if you can use your imagination a little bit, you would probably have a great deal of sort of green and red and yellows going on with the bushes, a thick band of blue at the bottom for the water. The boat itself might have been a golden yellow, and then the cow probably would have been white or black. And then the solar disk, red, and the ostrich feathers kind of a yellowish white. It would have really been quite beautiful once upon a time, but unfortunately no longer surviving. One thing that really hasn't survived well, unfortunately, is sanctuary. Now, this might just look like a lump of rock, and nowadays it kind of is. But what it's supposed to look like is this, a statue of Hathor physically emerging from the rock, from the mountain, with a figure of the king in front of her. We see images like this often in 2 dimensions in tombs, but also we do have physical examples from other monuments. This version on the left is a watercolor copy of a statue that is now, the statue itself is in the old Cairo Museum in Tahrir Square, but it's really hard to photograph, so it looks terrible in photos. But it looks like this, a kind of beautiful 3-dimensional statue of the goddess standing on a little podium with the king beneath her. She gives him her protection, of course. And then on the right, this example comes from a tomb of a high official who served Ramesses II, a chap named Ramesses. He built his tomb in Saqqara, and as part of that tomb, he had this little Hathor shrine with the goddess, you can see, physically emerging from the wall. And that's kind of a motif that Hathor is quite often associated with in this time. Hathor herself is not just a goddess of music, love, sex, joy, all that kind of thing. She can also be associated with the Western horizon, so therefore the land of the dead. And what you'll see in many of the tombs of this time period is paintings of Hathor as a cow emerging from the mountain of the West, as if she is welcoming the deceased, protecting them, taking them, helping them on their journey to the next life. The bovine statues within these temples, or the paintings on tomb walls, kind of communicate that aspect of the goddess. So she does have that afterlife, underworld aspect as well. Yeah, so that's kind of, on the left, you get the sense of what the shrine looks like now, unfortunately, but you can see the faint outlines of the cow horns coming down, the ears, the head coming down here, and then this little triangular part just below the head would be the head of the king, and then his body and legs coming down, much like this statue here in the left. So this is kind of what it's supposed to look like, and it's supposed to be vividly colored like this, but unfortunately it has not survived.